Lose it before it brings you nothing but grief. That's what the man told her. And though his voice never rose above a calm, level murmur, every syllable landed like a fist. Emma Walker stood frozen in the center of her grandfather's living room, both hands wrapped tight around a cracked old leather jacket that still carried his scent, and looked this total stranger dead in the eye. A man who had absolutely no business telling her what to do with the only thing she had left of him. 3 days. That's how long it had been since she'd lowered her grandfather into the ground. 3 sleepless, tear-soaked nights had passed since then, and now, standing in her own doorway, a polished stranger she'd never laid eyes on before was demanding she strip away the last physical piece of the man who raised her. Emma didn't flinch. She didn't so much as blink. She just asked, evenly, "Why does it matter to you what I put on my own back?" Before we dive deeper into this one, drop your city down in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels tonight. And if you're new around here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because trust me, you don't want to miss where this road leads. Now let's rewind the clock. 3 days earlier, a sleepy little desert town called Red Valley, Arizona, is where this all started. Emma Walker was 24 years old, and somehow, in that short span of life, she'd already absorbed more heartbreak than most people carry in 80 years. Her mother died when Emma was only 7. Her father packed up shortly after and vanished for good. The one constant, the single soul who never once made her feel like an inconvenience, was her grandfather, Thomas Walker. He'd raised her in a modest house on the outskirts of town, the kind with a porch swing that groaned in the wind and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of fresh coffee. He'd shown her how to change a flat tire, how to hold a steady aim, how to meet someone's eyes without flinching, and how to never, ever shrink herself to make someone else comfortable. You don't have to explain yourself to a single soul for simply being here, Emma, he used to tell her. Don't ever forget that. Back then, the words had floated past her without much weight. Now, they were starting to sink in. Thomas Walker died on a Tuesday, peacefully, in his sleep. Exactly the way he'd always said he hoped to go. No suffering, no fear. Just a man who shut his eyes one evening and quietly never opened them again. The funeral was intimate, a scattering of neighbors, the pastor from the church down on 5th, a few of Emma's co-workers from the vet clinic hovering uncomfortably near the back, unsure what words could possibly comfort a woman who just lost the last of her family. Not a single face from Thomas's earlier life showed up, not one. At the time, Emma had barely registered how strange that was. Grief has a way of drowning out every other thought, but the absence had lodged itself somewhere in the back of her mind all the same. 2 days after they buried him, standing alone inside a house that suddenly felt far too vast and far too silent, Emma decided it was time to sort through her grandfather's belongings. She told herself it was purely practical. The estate lawyer needed a list. The house would eventually need clearing out. Just clothes, just objects, just paperwork. That was the story she told herself. The real reason was simpler and harder to admit out loud. She wasn't ready to release him yet, and going through his things felt like one more way to keep him close a little longer. She began in his bedroom. The dresser held nothing unexpected: folded shirts, a watch that had long stopped ticking, a photo of 8-year-old Emma missing her front teeth, grinning like nothing in the world could ever touch her. She held that photograph for a long time before setting it gently aside. Then came the closet, packed tight with the wardrobe of a man who'd spent decades collecting flannel shirts. A couple of old suits he probably hadn't worn since her high school graduation, and work boots caked in the dust of a garden he'd given up tending years ago once his knees started failing him. She began pushing hangers aside one at a time, mentally sorting a donation pile, and that's when her fingers brushed something unfamiliar, something heavier, something that simply didn't fit. She tugged it forward, and her breath caught in her chest. A leather jacket, but not the kind a retired mechanic in a sleepy desert town would ever be caught wearing. This one was ancient, decades old by the look and feel of it. The leather had cracked and softened with age, the seams frayed along the shoulders. It had clearly seen a hard life. A long time ago. Emma turned it over in her hands, and then she saw it. Stitched across the back, faded, but still perfectly legible, was a patch. Hell's Angels. Her hands went completely still. For a long, suspended moment, she simply stared at the letters, convinced her exhausted, grief-scrambled mind had to be playing tricks on her. But it wasn't. The patch was real. The jacket was real. And it hadn't just been stored away. It had been hidden tucked behind old work clothes, at the very back of her grandfather's closet, as if he never wanted a single soul to stumble across it. "Grandpa," she whispered into the empty room. "What is this?" Thomas Walker had never once mentioned motorcycles, never owned one. As far as Emma knew, never breathed a word about clubs, or rides, or anything remotely connected to what that patch represented. He'd spent 40 years under the hood of other people's cars, at the same little garage on Route 9. He was in a pew every Sunday. He mowed the lawn like clockwork every Saturday morning, rain or shine, until his knees finally refused him. The man Emma had known simply didn't fit inside this jacket. And yet, here it sat, hidden like a secret he'd carried to his grave. Her hands trembled as she checked the pockets, some instinct telling her there was more. The outer pockets were empty, but the inner pocket, sewn close to where a man's heart would rest, held something folded and yellowed by time. A letter. Emma sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, jacket draped across her lap, and unfolded the paper with the kind of tenderness you'd reserve for something on the verge of falling apart. The handwriting was unmistakably his. She'd have known it anywhere, the same tilted slant, the same careful loops he used every year on her birthday cards, without fail. She began to read. Emma, if you're reading this, then I've gone, and you've found the jacket. I always figured you would, eventually. I hid it because I wasn't ready for you to see this part of who I was. And then, somehow, time slipped away the way it always does. There's a whole side of me you never knew. Things I should have told you myself, years ago. But I was scared of how you'd look at me once you knew. If you ever put that jacket on, someone out there will recognize it. Go find Marcus Hale. He'll be able to tell you why. I'm sorry I never told you the truth, sweetheart. I hope, someday, you can forgive me for that. I love you more than anything on this earth. Grandpa. Emma read it 3 times before the words fully settled in. Her hands weren't trembling from the cold anymore. This was something closer to shock. Who was Marcus Hale? What truth had her grandfather carried in silence her entire life, so carefully buried that even she, the person he raised, the person he loved beyond measure, had never once suspected a thing? She looked back down at the jacket, at the patch, at the cracked leather that had clearly witnessed years of a life Emma knew absolutely nothing about. Who? She whispered. The house gave her no answer. It never would. But somewhere out there, a man named Marcus Hale just might. Emma didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the jacket slung over the empty chair across from her, half expecting her grandfather to walk through the door himself and finally explain it all. She turned the letter over in her hands so many times the folds started to go soft. Find Marcus Hale. He'll know why. Why hadn't he just told her while he was still alive? Why leave a confession behind in a letter instead of sitting her down face to face? The way he'd explained everything else in her life, balancing a checkbook, mending a broken heart, changing her oil. Why hide this and only this, until he was already gone? She had no answer, and by the time the sun came up, she'd made a decision. She was going to find out, not because she had to, not because anyone was forcing her hand, but because for the first time since the funeral, she felt something other than grief. She felt purpose, and that, more than anything, was what pulled her out of bed that morning. She started close to home. Red Valley wasn't a large town. Everybody knew everybody. In that particular way, small desert towns cling to their history, whether the people in them want to or not. If a grandfather had once ridden with the Hells Angels, somebody here had to remember something. She began with Mrs. Delgado at the flower shop on Main Street, who'd lived in Red Valley longer than Emma had been alive. Mrs. Delgado, did you know my grandfather before he opened the garage? The older woman's polite smile flickered, just briefly, into something far more guarded. Your grandfather was a good man, Emma, a truly good man. That's not what I asked. Mrs. Delgado busied herself with a bundle of carnations, avoiding Emma's eyes entirely. Some things are better left buried where they lie. Sweetheart, he built himself a good life here. That's what matters now. I've got an order to finish, she said, turning away. You take care. Emma stood there, stunned by how abruptly the conversation had ended. That wasn't the reaction of a woman who didn't know anything. That was a woman who knew exactly something, and had made a very deliberate choice not to say it. The same thing happened at the hardware store, where the owner suddenly remembered an urgent phone call the second Emma mentioned her grandfather's name, alongside anything from the old days. It happened again at the diner, where a waitress who'd served Thomas coffee for 20 years abruptly found something critical to attend to in the kitchen. Nobody was rude. Nobody said a single unkind word, but every one of them, without exception, found a reason to end the conversation. The instant Emma pressed even slightly beneath the surface dot by the time she made it home that evening. One thing was crystal clear. This wasn't her imagination running wild. Whatever her grandfather had buried, half the town seemed to already know it, and every last one of them had silently agreed to shield that secret from her. The question was, why? Were they protecting Thomas's memory, or were they protecting Emma from something? That night, exhausted and no closer to an answer, Emma nearly talked herself into letting it go. Maybe her grandfather had good reason to keep his past sealed shut. Maybe, like Mrs. Delgado said, some things really were better left undisturbed. She almost believed that, right up until the doorbell rang the next morning, and a stranger's warning changed everything. Emma wasn't expecting company. She opened the door still in her work clothes, coffee mug in hand, expecting maybe a neighbor or a package, and instead found a man she'd never seen before standing on her porch. He looked to be around 50, dressed in a crisp button-down that seemed far too expensive for a town like this one. His hair combed back with the kind of precision that suggested he'd never had a single hard day in his life. Everything about him, the watch, the shoes, the deliberate way he carried himself, screamed money in a town that didn't have much of it. Emma Walker, he asked, though something in his tone made it clear he already knew. Can I help you? My name is Richard Cole. He said it like it should mean something, it didn't. I knew your grandfather. Emma's grip tightened around her mug. I'm sorry. I don't believe we've met. How exactly did you know him? We have history. Your grandfather and I. His smile never once touched his eyes. I heard about his passing. My condolences. Thank you, Emma said carefully. But I still don't understand why you're standing on my porch. Richard's gaze drifted past her, into the house, and Emma felt a small jolt as she realized the jacket was still draped visibly over the kitchen chair. His expression shifted, just barely, but enough. That jacket, he said, his voice dropping several degrees colder. Where did you find it? A chill crawled up Emma's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. In my grandfather's closet. Why does that matter to you? Richard took a step closer, though he never raised his voice. Every word that followed carried more weight than the last. That jacket belonged to someone whose legacy is far bigger than you could possibly understand. Lose it before it brings you nothing but grief. Emma stared at him, disbelief and fury rising in equal measure. Excuse me, I'm trying to help you, Richard said. And somehow, that only made it worse. You have no idea what that patch represents, or who might come looking for it. Do yourself a favor. Put it away. Forget you ever found it. Why does it matter to you what I wear? Emma shot back, her voice steadier than she felt inside. You just showed up on my doorstep, a man I've never met, telling me what to do with my own grandfather's belongings. That's not concern, Mr. Cole. That's a threat. Something flickered across his face. Irritation, maybe, or surprise that this grieving young woman wasn't simply crumbling under his tone. I'm not threatening you, he said smoothly. I'm warning you. There's a difference. From where I'm standing, it sounds identical. Richard studied her for a long beat, and Emma forced herself to hold his stare, refusing to be the one who looked away first. Your grandfather, he finally said, was a far more complicated man than you ever realized. Whatever you think you're going to uncover by digging through his past, I promise you, it will not be the story you're hoping for. Then tell me the truth, Emma said. If you knew him, if you know what that jacket means, just tell me. That's not my place. Then whose place is it? His jaw tightened. Leave it alone, Emma. That's the best advice you're going to get. He turned, walked back toward a polished black sedan parked at the curb. Car that looked as out of place on this street as he did, and drove off without another word. Emma stood frozen in the doorway long after he'd disappeared, heart hammering, coffee gone cold in her hand. Whatever secret her grandfather had buried, it was clearly bigger and far more dangerous than a few awkward questions at a flower shop. And for the first time, Emma understood something with absolute clarity. She wasn't just curious anymore. She was afraid, but she was also, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself, more determined than ever not to back down. That evening, Emma sat again at the kitchen table, letter and jacket both spread before her, and forced herself to think clearly instead of emotionally. Richard Cole knew something. The whole town seemed to know something, and her grandfather had left her exactly one thread to pull. Marcus Hale. She had no idea where to find him, no idea if he was even still alive, still in Arizona, still willing to talk. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she wasn't going to let some stranger's warning scare her away from the truth about the man who raised her. If anything, Richard Cole had made her decision easier, because a man who shows up uninvited to threaten a grieving woman over an old jacket isn't a man with nothing to hide. He's a man terrified of what she might find. The next morning, Emma called in sick to the clinic for the first time in 2 years, brushing aside the flicker of guilt, and spent hours hunched over her laptop chasing down anything at all connected to a Marcus Hale in Arizona. Most searches led nowhere. A handful of men sharing the name, none of them matching anything she could confirm. But buried 3 pages deep, she found a mention of an old motorcycle bar about 40 minutes outside Red Valley, out where the highway stretched into empty desert, a place called the Iron Road. The reviews were sparse, but one line from an old forum post caught her eye. *Gold Bar, mostly Hell's Angels crowd, been around forever. Ask for Marcus if you want to hear the real stories. She read that line 4 times, pulse quickening. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the first genuine lead she'd had since finding the jacket. And after 2 days of slammed doors and nervous neighbors, it felt like the first crack of light in a room that had stayed dark far too long. She looked over at the jacket still draped across the chair, the patch catching the afternoon sun through the window. Her grandfather's voice echoed through 100 memories at once. You don't have to explain yourself for simply being here, Emma. Don't ever forget that. She hadn't understood, back then, the kind of courage that lesson would one day demand of her. She understood now. Emma stood, crossed the room, and lifted the jacket into her arms. It was heavier than it looked, worn soft in places from decades of use, and carried a faint scent she couldn't quite name. Cedar, maybe. Or the ghost of old cigarette smoke. She thought of Richard's warning. Lose it before it brings you nothing but grief. She thought of Mrs. Delgado's careful, guarded silence. She thought of her grandfather, a man who fixed cars and mowed lawns and never once raised his voice in anger, hiding this jacket for reasons he'd chosen to carry to his grave rather than explain. And she made a choice that would change everything. She was going to wear it, not because she wanted trouble, not because she understood what it meant, but because it was the last piece of him she had left, and she refused to let a stranger's fear dictate what she did with her own inheritance. The drive to the Iron Road took nearly 45 minutes, most of it a longer stretch of highway, where the desert opened up flat and endless in every direction, the kind of road that gives a person far too much time to think. Emma gripped the wheel and tried to hold on to her nerve. She told herself, over and over, that this was simply about finding answers. She wasn't looking for a fight. She wasn't trying to prove anything to Richard Cole or the whispering neighbors back home. She only wanted to understand who her grandfather really was. But when the bar finally came into view, a low building surrounded by a gravel lot full of motorcycles gleaming under the sun, her resolve wavered. For the first time, there had to be 30 bikes parked out front. She'd never seen anything like it. Chrome catching the light, leather draped over seats, the low murmur of voices drifting out from somewhere inside. Emma sat in her car for a long moment, hands still on the wheel, jacket folded on the passenger seat beside her. You don't have to explain yourself for simply being here. She put the jacket on. The leather settled over her shoulders, heavier than she expected, as if it carried the weight of everything she didn't yet understand. She caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, a 24-year-old veterinary assistant, wrapped in a Hell's Angels jacket that had belonged to a man the whole town seemed too afraid to discuss. She looked like she didn't belong in it. Somehow, she felt like she did. Emma got out of the car before she could talk herself out of it and walked toward the entrance of the Iron Road, heart pounding with every step, with no idea that the moment she stepped through that door, everything she thought she knew about her quiet, gentle grandfather was about to change forever. The door was heavier than she expected, the kind of solid wood that had absorbed decades of slamming and shoving and the occasional drunken shoulder. She pushed it open and stepped inside before her nerve could fail her. Noise hit her first, a low conversation, the clink of glasses, a jukebox playing something with a slow, aching guitar line. Then, one by one, the noise began to die. Emma felt it before she understood it, heads turning, sentences trailing off mid-word. That particular silence that falls over a room the second something unexpected walks in. She kept her chin level and moved toward the bar, doing her best to look like she belonged, even as every instinct in her body screamed otherwise. A man near the pool table set his cue down slowly, eyes locked not on her face, but on the patch stitched across her shoulders. "That's not possible," someone muttered. Another voice, lower, disbelieving. "That's Walker's jacket." Emma froze mid-step. They recognized it, not just the patch, not just the club, this specific piece of leather, as if they'd seen it worn 100 times before. An older man near the corner lowered his head. Beside him, another man actually removed his hat and pressed it to his chest, like he was standing at a second funeral. Nobody approached her. Nobody spoke a word directly to her. They simply stared, some in shock, some in something closer to grief, all of it wrapped in a silence heavy enough to raise the hair on Emma's arms. She'd braced for confrontation. She'd expected hostility from a room full of strangers, wondering why an outsider dared wear their patch. She had not expected this, a silence so thick it felt almost like reverence. When she finally found her voice, it came out smaller than she intended. "I'm looking for someone. Marcus Hale." The name dropped into the room, a stone into still water. More heads turned. More conversations died completely. Somewhere behind the bar, a glass was set down with unusual care, as if the person holding it needed a moment to process what they'd just heard. Then, from a corner table Emma hadn't even noticed, a voice spoke, quiet, but unmistakably in command of the room the moment it broke the silence. "I'm Marcus Hale." Emma turned. The man seated there carried exactly the kind of presence that could still an entire bar without raising his voice. Somewhere in his 50s, maybe older, with a thick grey beard trimmed close and hair swept back from a face weathered by decades of sun and hard living. His bare arms, beneath a black sleeveless vest, were covered in tattoos faded just enough to suggest they were older than Emma herself. On the back of his vest, stitched in white and red, sat the very same patch she now wore. He didn't stand. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her. Really looked. His eyes travelling from her face to the jacket and back again. Something unreadable shifting behind his expression. "Where?" Marcus asked slowly. "Did you get that jacket?" Emma's throat tightened. "It belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Walker." The room went, impossibly, even quieter. Marcus's face didn't outwardly change, but Emma caught something move behind his eyes, recognition, disbelief, and something like old, buried pain, all colliding at once. "Thomas Walker," he repeated, as if testing whether the name was real or a trick his own mind was playing. "You're Tom's granddaughter?" "Yes." Her voice cracked, and she hated that it did. "He passed away last week. I found this jacket in his closet, along with a letter telling me to find you. He said you'd know why." Marcus eased back slowly in his chair, gaze never leaving her face. For a long, heavy moment, he said nothing at all. Emma had driven 45 minutes into the desert, walked into a bar full of strangers, and put on a dead man's jacket, all on the hope that this exact moment might finally hand her the answers she'd been chasing for 3 sleepless days. She hadn't expected it to feel like this, like something enormous, buried for decades, was finally beginning to surface. "Sit down," Marcus said at last, nodding toward the empty chair across from him. "You and I have a lot to talk about." Emma had barely taken a step toward the chair when the door behind her swung open again, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She didn't need to turn around to know who had just walked in. She could feel it in the way every man in the bar went rigid, in the way Marcus's expression hardened into something sharp and watchful, in the way the fragile tension of recognition curdled instantly into something far more dangerous. "Well," Richard Cole's voice rang out from the doorway, cold and composed. "I told you to leave it alone, Emma." She turned slowly, heart pounding, and found Richard standing just inside the entrance, his expensive shirt and polished shoes looking even more out of place in the iron road than she herself had felt only minutes earlier. But there was nothing out of place about the way he moved. He walked like a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You didn't listen," Richard said, eyes flicking from Emma to the jacket to Marcus, something calculating passing behind his gaze. "That's disappointing. I really was trying to help you." Marcus rose slowly from his chair, and though his voice never climbed, the authority behind it filled the whole room. "Richard, you've got exactly 10 seconds to explain why you're standing in my bar." "Your bar," Richard repeated, something like amusement flickering across his face. "Careful, Marcus. Times have changed since you and Tom Walker ran this town." The words landed like a slap. Every head in the room swung back toward Emma, and this time the silence carried something else entirely, the unmistakable sense that whatever happened next would answer every question she'd carried since finding that jacket. Marcus's jaw tightened. "You don't get to say his name," he said quietly. "Not after everything you did." Richard's smile didn't waver, but something colder settled behind his eyes. "We'll see about that," he said, gaze sliding back to Emma. "Because that jacket she's wearing, it's not just a memory, sweetheart. It's a claim. And claims like that have a way of dragging old debts back to the surface." Emma's stomach dropped. "What debts? What are you talking about?" Richard didn't answer. He only smiled, turned, and walked back out the door he'd just come through, leaving Emma standing in the middle of a room full of strangers, her grandfather's jacket heavy on her shoulders, more questions burning in her chest than she had ever carried in her life. Marcus watched the door swing shut, expression unreadable, then turned back to Emma with something close to sorrow. "Sit down," he said again, softer this time. "It's time you finally learned the truth about your grandfather." Emma sat, and somewhere behind Marcus Hale's tired, guarded eyes, she could see it, the first flicker of a story decades in the making, one that was about to rewrite everything she thought she knew about the quiet, gentle man who raised her. Marcus didn't sit back down right away. He stood there a moment, studying Emma like a man trying to decide whether the woman in front of him was real or some kind of ghost wearing a dead man's leather. The bar hadn't returned to normal. Nobody had picked their cues back up. Nobody had gone back to their beer. Every single person in the Iron Road was still watching, waiting to see what their leader would do. A big man near the jukebox finally broke the silence. "Marcus." His voice was low, careful, but edged. "You sure about this? We don't know this girl. Anybody can put on a jacket." Marcus didn't even turn his head. "Sit down, Deacon." "I'm just saying," I said, "sit down." Deacon didn't argue further, but Emma felt his eyes on her the whole time. He lowered himself onto a bar stool, arms crossed, clearly unconvinced. She understood the suspicion. She'd have felt it too in his shoes. A stranger walks in wearing a Legends jacket, and within 5 minutes, there's already a war of words with a man in an expensive shirt threatening her by name. Of course they were Werry Dot. Marcus finally sat back down across from her, folding his tattooed forearms on the table between them. "You want the truth about your grandfather. I'm going to give it to you. But you need to understand something first. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story I've spoken out loud in almost 30 years. Not because I forgot it. Because I promised him I wouldn't." Emma's throat tightened. "Then why tell me now?" "Because he's gone," Marcus said simply. "And because you're sitting across from me, wearing his colors, which means he wanted you to know. That was always the deal. If that jacket ever came back into this room." The silence was over. Emma swallowed hard. "Okay. I'm listening." Marcus glanced once around the bar, a silent command, and slowly, reluctantly, the other members returned to their drinks, conversations dropping to murmurs instead of stares. Only Deacon kept watching from his corner, arms still crossed. "Your grandfather," Marcus began, "was the best man I ever knew. And I mean that in a way most people wouldn't understand, because most folks think a man wearing a patch like this one can't possibly be good. They're wrong. Tom Walker is the reason I'm alive to sit here and tell you that." Emma leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Marcus's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. "I was 19, strung out, sleeping behind a gas station 2 towns over, when your grandfather found me. I'd already lost everything. My mother had thrown me out. My so-called friends had robbed me blind. I was maybe 2 bad decisions from not making it to 20. Tom didn't know me from anybody. He had no reason to stop. But he did. What did he do? Pulled his truck over, walked up like I was somebody worth talking to, and said, 'You look like a man who needs a meal more than whatever's in your pocket.' I told him to get lost. He didn't. He just sat down on the curb next to me and waited until I was ready to talk." Something tightened in Emma's chest, an ache she hadn't expected, that sounded exactly like the man who raised her, patient, immovable, quietly certain that people were worth saving even when they didn't believe it themselves. "He gave me work at his garage," Marcus continued, "taught me to fix an engine, gave me somewhere to sleep until I got back on my feet. And when I finally asked why he was doing all this for a total stranger, you know what he told me?" Emma shook her head. He said, "Somebody did the same for me once. I'm just passing it forward." The bar had gone quiet enough that Emma could hear her own heartbeat. "Your grandfather started this chapter of the club almost 40 years ago," Marcus said. "Not for the parties, not for the reputation. He built it because he believed men like me, broken men everybody else had already given up on, deserved somebody in their corner. That patch you're wearing was never about power, Emma. It was a promise. Every man who wore it swore to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. Kids, widows, old folks getting robbed blind by their own landlords, whoever needed it." Emma's eyes stung, and she hated how quickly the tears came. "Then why did he leave? Why hide all of this from me my whole life?" Marcus's expression darkened, and for the first time since she'd walked in, Emma saw something other than warmth behind his eyes. Grief, old, buried, unresolved. "That," he said, "is where Richard Cole enters this story." The name landed like a struck match. Deacon's head snapped up from across the bar. A few older members traded glances Emma couldn't read. Whatever history existed between her grandfather and Richard Cole, it clearly wasn't a secret to anyone here except her. Richard's father, Marcus said, was a man named Everett Cole, owned half of Red Valley in his day, the bank, most of the land, half the businesses on Main Street, ran this town like his own private kingdom. Anybody who wouldn't bow found their loans called, their leases cancelled, their lives made very difficult, and my grandfather stood up to him. Your grandfather did more than that, Marcus said. He exposed him. Emma sat forward. Exposed him for what? Marcus took a slow breath, like the memory itself carried physical weight. There was a boy, 16 years old, kid named Danny Ruiz, lived a few streets from the garage. Everett Cole rented out slum housing on the edge of town. Buildings he barely maintained, buildings that should have been condemned years earlier. One winter, a space heater in one of those units sparked a fire. Danny didn't make it out. Emma's stomach dropped. Oh my God. Everett had been warned about that building over and over. City inspectors, tenants, even his own maintenance crew told him the wiring was a hazard. He ignored every single warning, because fixing it would have cost him money. When Danny died, Everett tried to bury the whole thing, paid off an inspector to backdate a safety report, made it look like the fire wasn't his fault at all. And your grandfather found out. He found the real inspection records, Marcus said. Don't ask me how. Tom always had ways of getting information nobody else could get. He took what he found straight to the county, straight to the newspapers, straight to anybody who would listen. He didn't care that Everett Cole owned half this town. He cared that a 16-year-old boy was dead because a rich man didn't want to spend money keeping him safe. Tears slid down Emma's face now, and she didn't bother wiping them away. What happened? Everett Cole lost everything, Marcus said. The bank pulled his charter. He went to prison for a fraud and negligent homicide. Died there 5 years into a 12-year sentence. He paused. And Richard Cole, his only son, watched his family's entire empire collapse because of one mechanic who wouldn't stay quiet. The pieces began clicking together in Emma's mind, one after another, faster than she could fully process. That's why Richard came to my house, she said slowly. That's why he's been watching me. This was never about a jacket. This is revenge. It's more complicated than revenge, Marcus said. But you're not wrong that it's personal. Before Emma could ask what he meant, the door to the iron road swung open again, and every head in the bar turned at once, bodies bracing as one. It wasn't Richard. It was a woman, younger, maybe 30, dressed in a courier's uniform, clutching an envelope like it might burn her fingers. I'm looking for somebody named Marcus Hale, she said, voice trembling under the weight of 30 pairs of eyes. I was told to deliver this here, in person, today. Marcus stood and crossed the room, taking the envelope without a word. He tore it open on the spot, scanning the contents, and Emma watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something dangerously close to fury. What is it? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed the paper across the table, and Emma's hands trembled as she took it. A legal notice. A notice of intent to seize property, addressed to the Iron Road Motorcycle Club, an associated trust, citing an unpaid lien on the land the bar sat on. Land, Emma realized with a jolt, that had originally belonged to her grandfather. This land was Tom's, Marcus said quietly, reading over her shoulder. He put it in trust for the club 30 years ago, back when Everett Cole was trying to buy up every inch of Red Valley he could get his hands on. Tom made sure this one piece could never be touched by the Coles. Then how can Richard? Because trusts have conditions, Marcus said. And for the first time, Emma heard genuine fear beneath his anger. Tom's trust required a blood descendant to formally claim it and reaffirm the agreement within 1 year of his death, or the land defaults back to whoever holds the original mineral and mortgage rights on the property. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Emma. Let me guess, who holds those rights? Marcus's silence was answer enough. Richard Cole's been sitting on those rights 4 years, he finally said. Waiting. He probably never even thought Tom had a living heir who'd show up in time. If nobody claims his trust by the deadline, this bar, this land, everything your grandfather built to protect this club, it goes straight into Richard Cole's hands. And once he owns it, nothing stops him from bulldozing this place. And everything else Tom ever built in this town. Emma stared down at the paper, her grandfather's careful, deliberate planning suddenly snapping into terrifying focus. He hadn't hidden this jacket out of shame. He'd hidden it as a weapon, saved for exactly this moment, in case the man who destroyed his best friend's son ever came looking for what remained of his legacy. How long? Emma asked, voice barely steady. Do we have? Marcus checked the date on the notice, dread passing behind his eyes. 6 days. The words landed like a physical blow. Deacon uncrossed his arms and rose from his stool, his suspicion of Emma apparently forgotten in the face of a much bigger threat. 6 days, he repeated. Marcus, that's nothing. That's not even enough time to file the paperwork, let alone fight Cole's lawyers in court. I'm aware. So what do we do? Marcus looked at Emma for a long moment, and she felt the full weight of what he was about to ask before he even said it. Emma has to formally claim the trust, Marcus said, in front of the county recorder, in front of witnesses, before the deadline hits. If she does that, the land stays protected exactly the way Tom intended. And if I don't, Emma said quietly, Richard wins everything. Nobody in the bar argued with that. Emma sat there, gripping the legal notice with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and felt something shift in her chest, grief giving way to something harder, something closer to resolve. 3 days ago she'd been a grieving granddaughter who didn't even know her own family history. Now she was being asked to stand between a dead man's promise and a predator's revenge, with 6 days on the clock and a stranger's threat still ringing in her ears. Okay, she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. Tell me what I need to do. Marcus's expression softened, something like pride flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. First, he said, you need to understand, you won't be doing this alone, Marcus. Deacon cut in, voice lower now, more serious. You really think Cole's going to sit back and let this happen quietly? A legal notice today means he's already moving. He's not going to wait around for some girl he's never met to walk into the county office and ruin his plans. I know that. So what's the play? Marcus was quiet a moment, eyes settling on Emma, studying her the way a man studies a bridge he isn't sure will hold his weight. The play, he said slowly, is that Emma doesn't just claim the trust. She earns this room first. Emma frowned. What does that mean? It means half the men in this bar don't know you from Eve. You showed up wearing your grandfather's colors, and that buys you attention, not loyalty. If Richard Cole comes at this the way I think he's going to come at it, you're going to need more than a piece of paper and a name. You're going to need people willing to stand behind you when it counts. Deacon made a low sound, somewhere between doubt and challenge. And how exactly is she supposed to earn that in 6 days? Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Emma directly, his gaze steady and serious enough to make her sit up straighter. Tell me something true about your grandfather, he said. Something only his blood would know. Not something you read in a letter. Something you lived. Emma blinked, caught off guard. And then something rose up in her memory, sudden and unbidden. When I was 12, she said slowly, I got jumped walking home from school. 3 older girls, over something stupid, some rumor that wasn't even true. I came home with a split lip and wouldn't tell him what happened. He didn't yell. He didn't push. He just sat with me on the porch for 2 hours until I finally told him the truth. And then, you know what he did. What? He didn't go find those girls. He didn't call their parents. Instead, he taught me how to defend myself. Every Saturday morning for a year, before he opened the garage, we'd go out back, and he'd teach me how to block a punch, how to slip out of somebody's grip, how to stand my ground without needing anybody to rescue me. Emma's voice cracked. He said the world was never going to stop testing me, so I needed to learn how to pass the test myself. The bar had gone silent again, but this silence felt different, less suspicious, heavier with something like recognition. Deacon was the one who finally broke it, his voice rougher than it had been all afternoon. "That's Tom," he said quietly. "That's exactly him." Marcus nodded slowly, something settling into place behind his eyes. "Not quite trust yet, but the first real steps toward it." "All right," he said. "Here's what happens next." He laid it out plainly. In 6 days, the club would need to gather every founding document, every original piece of the trust agreement, everything Thomas Walker had filed decades earlier to protect this land from exactly this kind of attack. Marcus knew where most of it was, a locked box in the back office of the bar, untouched since long before Emma was born. But some of it, he suspected, might still be sitting back at Thomas's house, hidden the same careful way the jacket had been. "You need to go through everything in that house again," Marcus told her. "Every drawer, every box, every hiding spot you can think of. If your grandfather left you that jacket as a message, I promise you, Emma, he left more than that. Tam never did anything halfway. If he built a trust to survive exactly this kind of fight, he built a paper trail to back it. And if Richard gets to it first..." Marcus's expression hardened. "Then we've got a much bigger problem than a legal deadline." As if summoned by the words themselves, Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a text from the clinic asking why she'd missed another shift, and instead found an unknown number, a message waiting on the screen. She opened it and felt the blood drain from her face. Asterisk, "You should have listened to me. Emma, 6 days isn't very long. I'd hate for something to happen to that pretty little house before you get the chance to keep it." Asterisk, her hand trembled as she turned the phone around, showing the screen to Marcus without a word. His jaw clenched so tight Emma could see the muscle working beneath his beard. "Deacon," he said, his voice suddenly all business, stripped of any warmth. "Get 4 riders. Now. On it." Deacon was already moving, pulling out his own phone. "Emma," Marcus turned back to her, eyes sharp with an urgency that hadn't been there a moment before. "We're going to your grandfather's house right now, together." Emma stood so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. "You think he's serious? You think he'd actually touch the house?" "I think," Marcus said grimly, already walking toward the door, "that Richard Cole spent his entire life learning exactly how far his father was willing to go to get what he wanted. And I don't intend to find out the hard way whether the son learned the same lessons outside." The gravel lot that had been quiet when Emma first arrived was now a storm of motion, engines roaring to life, one after another, men swinging onto their bikes with the kind of practiced urgency that told Emma this wasn't the first crisis this club had faced together. Deacon was already pulling on his helmet. To more riders Emma hadn't even spoken to fell into formation beside him, faces set with a grim determination that tightened her chest with something unexpected. They didn't know her. 20 minutes ago, half of them had looked at her like a stranger wearing a costume she had no right to wear, and now they were gearing up to defend a house they'd never seen, for a woman most of them had just met, because of a name stitched into the back of a jacket and a promise made decades before Emma was even born. Marcus swung a leg over his bike and looked back at her, something steady and certain in his expression, despite the chaos around them. "Get in your car," he said. "Follow us, stay close, and don't stop for anything between here and Red Valley. Understand me?" Emma nodded, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "I understand." "Good." He started his engine, the sound swallowed almost instantly by a dozen others roaring to life around him. "Because whatever Richard Cole thinks he's going to find waiting for him at that house," he said, loud enough to carry over the engines, "he's about to learn that Tom Walker's family doesn't stand alone. Not while there's breath left in any of us." The ride back to Red Valley felt longer than the drive out. Even though the distance hadn't changed, Emma kept her eyes fixed on the taillights ahead of her, on the moving wall of leather and chrome surrounding her car like a fortress on wheels, and tried to keep her breathing steady, even as her mind raced through every worst-case scenario Richard's message could mean. Was he already there? Had he sent someone else? Was this a bluff, meant to scare her into backing down? Or was Richard Cole exactly the kind of man his father had been, willing to burn down anything standing between him and what he wanted? By the time the familiar shape of her grandfather's house came into view, porch light glowing faintly against the darkening sky, Emma's hands were slick against the wheel. The house looked untouched. No broken windows, no forced entry, no black sedan waiting in the driveway. But the moment Marcus's bike rolled to a stop at the curb, he raised a hand, signaling the others to hold position, his eyes scanning the property with a wariness she hadn't seen from him yet. "Wait here," he said quietly. "This is my grandfather's house," Emma said, already reaching for her door handle. "I'm not waiting in the car." Marcus turned, and for a moment she thought he might argue. Instead, something in her expression must have convinced him, because he simply nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Stay behind me. And if I tell you to run, you run. No questions." Emma nodded, throat too tight to speak. They approached the front door together, Deacon and two other riders fanning out silently around the perimeter, checking windows, checking the side yard, checking the detached garage where her grandfather had spent 40 years fixing other people's broken engines. The front door was locked, exactly as Emma had left it. Marcus tried the handle anyway, glancing back at her. Key. She fumbled in her pocket, hands shaking, and finally produced it, sliding it into the lock with fingers that didn't want to cooperate. The door swung open onto darkness, the familiar shape of her grandfather's living room, barely visible in the dim evening light filtering through the windows. For one horrible second, Emma braced herself to see the room ransacked, drawers pulled, furniture overturned, every trace of her grandfather's life torn apart by careless, searching hands. Instead, everything sat exactly as she'd left it that morning, untouched. Marcus flipped the light switch, and the room flooded with warm, ordinary light, revealing nothing more sinister than the same quiet house Emma had grown up in, the same worn armchair, the same photographs on the mantel, the same silence that had haunted her every night since the funeral. "It's fine," Emma breathed, relief crushing through her, so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. "Everything's fine." He didn't. The sound of shattering glass from somewhere behind the house cut her off mid-sentence. Marcus's hand shot out, gripping her arm, pulling her back toward the door, even as Deacon's voice rang out from the backyard, sharp with alarm. "Marcus, garage. Somebody's in the garage." Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. "That's where he kept everything," she gasped. "All his tools, his old work records." "Stay here," Marcus ordered, already moving toward the back of the house, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I mean it, Emma. Stay in this house." She didn't stay. She was 3 steps behind him before she'd even fully decided to move, adrenaline drowning out every ounce of caution. Following the sound of raised voices and scuffling footsteps toward the detached garage, the same garage where her grandfather had taught her to change a tire, the same garage that might hold the last pieces of proof standing between her family's legacy and Richard Cole's revenge. What she found there, lit by the harsh beam of Deacon's flashlight, stopped her cold in the doorway. A man she didn't recognize stood frozen in the middle of the garage, crowbar in one hand, a half-pried open floor safe in front of him. A safe Emma had never even known existed, hidden beneath a false panel in the concrete floor her grandfather had walked over 10,000 times without ever giving away its secret. The man's eyes went wide as 3 bikers surrounded him. "Any chance of escape instantly gone? Who sent you?" Marcus demanded, his voice low and dangerous in a way Emma hadn't heard from him yet. The man's mouth opened, closed, opened again, panic written across every line of his face. And in that frozen, breathless moment, Emma understood with total, bone-deep certainty that Richard Cole had never intended to wait 6 days at all. The man with the crowbar didn't answer right away. He looked at Marcus, then Deacon, then the 2 other riders blocking the only exit, and Emma watched something calculating pass behind his panicked eyes. The look of a man doing quick math on whether he could talk his way out, or needed to fight his way out instead. "I asked you a question," Marcus said, stepping closer. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me." the man said to Fast, voice cracking. This place looked empty. I thought, try again. Deacon's voice was flat, unimpressed. You brought a crowbar for an empty house. You knew exactly where that safe was hidden. Nobody breaks into a garage and heads straight for a floor panel, unless somebody told them where to look. The man's eyes darted toward the open garage door, toward the narrow gap of darkness beyond the ring of bikers surrounding him. And Emma saw the exact moment he decided to run. He never got the chance. Marcus moved faster than a man his age had any right to, closing the distance into strides and pinning the man's wrist against the workbench before the crowbar could even lift off the ground. It clattered to the concrete, and the man let out a sharp cry that echoed off the walls. Marcus. Emma's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, some instinct rising in her that couldn't stomach violence happening in the same garage where her grandfather had once patiently taught her to check her own oil. Don't hurt him. Marcus didn't let go, but he didn't tighten his grip either, eyes flicking to her for a moment before settling back on the trembling man. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, low and controlled. Not if you start talking. But you're going to tell us exactly who paid you to break into this garage, or I promise you, the next people to show up here are going to be the county sheriff. And breaking and entering, combined with attempted theft, is going to look a whole lot worse than whatever you're being paid to stay quiet about. The man's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him all at once. Richard Cole, he said quietly, paid me $2,000 to get into that safe before anybody claimed it. Said there'd be papers inside, deeds, trust documents, something like that. He wanted them gone before some girl showed up trying to use them. The floor tilted beneath Emma's feet. He hadn't been bluffing. The text message hadn't been an idle scare tactic. It had been a distraction, timed perfectly to pull her and Marcus away from the house long enough for someone else to finish the job, while they were still 45 minutes down the highway. How did he know about the safe? Marcus demanded. That panel's been hidden under concrete for 30 years. Tom didn't tell anybody where it was. The man shook his head helplessly. I don't know, man, I swear. He just gave me the address, told me exactly where to look, told me to be quick about it. Said the girl and some biker would be gone for at least an hour. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Emma saw something shift behind his eyes. Not just anger now, but a colder, more focused alarm. Somebody's watching this house, he said, almost to himself. He knew the second we left. The realization settled over the garage, a physical weight. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how exposed she'd been this entire time without ever realizing it. Sorting through her grandfather's things alone in an empty house. Driving out to the iron road without telling a single soul. Never once considering someone might be tracking her every move. Call the sheriff, Marcus told Deacon. Let's get this handled properly. I don't want Richard Cole having any excuse to say we handled this outside the law. Deacon nodded, already pulling out his phone, while the other two riders kept the trembling intruder pinned against the workbench. Emma stood frozen, staring down at the half-pried safe embedded in the garage floor. Its metal edges scraped raw, where the crowbar had dug in before Marcus stopped him. Her grandfather had built this, not just the safe, the whole quiet, careful architecture of protection that had apparently been running beneath her entire life without her ever noticing. A hidden jacket, a hidden letter, a hidden trust, a hidden safe buried beneath concrete in a garage she'd walked through 1,000 times as a child, never once suspecting there was an entire second life buried just beneath the surface of the only home she'd ever known. He knew this day might come, Emma said softly, more to herself than anyone else. He built all of this specifically in case Richard Cole ever came looking. Marcus knelt beside the safe, examining the damage the crowbar had already done, his expression grim. Your grandfather spent 30 years preparing for exactly this. He wasn't naive, Emma. He knew Richard would come eventually, one way or another. He just didn't know it would happen this fast, or that you'd be the one standing in the middle of it. The sheriff's department arrived 20 minutes later, red and blue lights washing silently across the front of the house. Emma spent the next hour giving a statement to a deputy who looked barely older than she was, watching as the man with the crowbar was walked to a patrol car in handcuffs, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by the hollow, resigned look of someone who understood exactly how badly he'd underestimated the situation he'd been paid to walk into. He's going to give up Cole's name, the deputy told Marcus quietly before climbing into his own cruiser. Breaking and entering, attempted theft. That's enough to make most people talk once the DAR starts offering deals. It won't matter, Marcus said once the patrol cars had pulled away. The quiet of the street settling back over them, a held breath finally released. Richard's got enough lawyers to make this disappear before it ever touches him directly. Best case, that man does a little time and never says Richard's name again. Because somebody makes it worth his while to stay quiet. Emma stood on the porch, arms still wrapped around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air, watching Marcus finally pry the damaged safe fully open now that the immediate danger had passed. Inside, wrapped carefully in an old oil-stained cloth, sat a thick stack of documents that had clearly been protected from moisture and time with the same careful precision Thomas Walker applied to everything else in his life. Marcus lifted them out gently, like something sacred, and spread them across the workbench under the harsh garage light. Emma stepped closer, breath-catching as she recognized her grandfather's careful, slanted handwriting across document after document, deeds, notarized statements, old photographs she'd never seen before, and beneath it all, a leather-bound journal that looked older than Emma herself. What is all this? She whispered. Marcus opened the journal to its first page, expression softening into something achingly close to grief. This, he said quietly, is everything. Emma, every name, every date, every piece of proof he ever gathered against Everett Cole. And from the looks of some of these later entries, he flipped forward, scanning quickly, eyebrows drawing together, against Richard, too. Emma's heart pounded. What do you mean, against Richard? I thought this was all about his father. Marcus held up a page, and Emma leaned in to read her grandfather's handwriting, dated only 4 years earlier. Richard's been buying up water rights across the county under shell companies. If he controls the water, he controls every farm and rancher within 50 miles, whether he ever touches their land directly or not. Same as his father. Different method. Same hunger. Emma read it twice, disbelief settling into something colder and more certain. This isn't just about revenge for what happened to Danny Ruiz, she said slowly. My grandfather was still watching him, still building a case against him, right up until... She stopped herself before she could finish, but Marcus finished it for her, voice quiet and steady. Right up until he died, which means Richard Cole didn't just show up on your porch because of an old grudge from 30 years ago. Emma, he showed up because he's terrified of what your grandfather might have left behind. And now he knows exactly how right he was to be scared. The weight of that realization settled over Emma like a physical thing. This wasn't simply about protecting a piece of land, or honoring a dead man's final wishes, or even proving to a room full of strangers that she belonged in her grandfather's jacket. This was about stopping a man actively, presently, still trying to tighten his grip on an entire community, the same way his father had, just quieter, smarter, patient enough to avoid the same mistakes that landed Everett Cole in prison. We need to get all of this somewhere safe, Marcus said, already gathering the documents back into their protective cloth, somewhere Richard can't reach it, and somewhere it can be verified by people who can't be bought or intimidated. The county recorder's office, Emma said, for the trust claim, that, and the lawyer, Marcus said. A good one with no ties to Cole money. Emma nodded, mind already racing through logistics, the timeline. The 6 days that had now shrunk to 5.5 thanks to the hours already lost driving back and forth between Red Valley and the Iron Road. But before she could say anything else, her phone buzzed again, and this time when she pulled it out, her hands were steadier than they'd been the last time. She half expected another threat from Richard. Instead, The screen showed a missed call from an unfamiliar number, along with a voicemail that had come in sometime during the chaos of the last hour. She played it, holding the phone up so Marcus could hear. The voice was elderly, shaking, unmistakably frightened. Emma. This is Harold Whitfield. I used to be your grandfather's attorney, years back. I need you to call me the second you get this message. Don't go to Richard Cole's office. Don't sign anything he sends you. And Emma, be careful who you trust right now. There are people in this town who owe Richard Cole a lot more than they'll ever admit to your face. The voicemail ended, and silence fell heavy over the garage. Harold Whitfield, Marcus repeated, voice low and grim. I remember that name. He handled the original trust paperwork 30 years ago, back when your grandfather first set all this up. His eyes narrowed. If he's warning you now, out of nowhere, after decades of silence, something's got him spooked enough to break whatever agreement he made to stay quiet. Emma dialed the number back immediately, heart hammering as it rang once, twice, 3 times before finally connecting. Hello. The same shaking voice from the voicemail, tight with anxiety. Mr. Whitfield. It's Emma Walker, Thomas Walker's granddaughter. You just called me. A long pause stretched on the other end, long enough that Emma wondered if the call had dropped. Emma, the old man finally said, voice dropping even lower, as if afraid of being overheard even in what she assumed was the privacy of his own home. Thank God. Listen to me very carefully, because I don't have much time and I don't trust this line. I'm listening. Richard Cole came to see me 2 days ago, Harold said. Before your grandfather's funeral was even over, he wanted to know if I still had copies of the original trust documents. I told him no, that everything had been transferred to the county records decades ago. Standard procedure, he paused. That was a lie, Emma. I kept copies. Your grandfather asked me to, in case something like this ever happened. Emma's breath caught. You have copies of the trust. I have more than that, Harold said, voice tightening with something that sounded almost like fear. I have Richard Cole's signature on a document he doesn't even know still exists. Something your grandfather made him sign 15 years ago. When Richard first tried to buy this land out from under the club, using a shell company, Marcus, listening intently beside her, went suddenly very still. What kind of document? Emma asked. An acknowledgement, Harold said. A legal admission that Richard Cole knew, at the time, that the land was protected under an irrevocable trust, and that any future attempt to seize it through mineral or mortgage rights would constitute deliberate, premeditated fraud. He let that settle. Your grandfather was thorough, Emma. He didn't just protect this land. He made sure that if Richard Cole had tried what he's trying right now, there'd be a paper trail proving. He knew exactly what he was doing. Something clicked into place in Emma's chest, a piece of hope, finally breaking through the fear that had gripped her since Richard's threatening text. Can you bring that document forward? She asked. Can you testify to it? Harold was quiet a long moment. I'm scared, Emma, he admitted finally, voice cracking with an honesty that made her chest ache. Richard Cole is a dangerous man, and I'm 78 years old, with a wife who depends on me. But I made a promise to your grandfather 30 years ago, and I've watched Richard slowly choke the life out of this town for the last decade, buying up everything he touches, ruining anyone who stands in his way. A long breath crackles through the line. I'm done being afraid of him. I'll bring the documents. I'll testify. But we need to move fast, and we need to be smart about it, because the moment he realizes I'm involved, he's not going to sit back and let this happen quietly. Thank you, Emma breathed, relief and gratitude flooding through her all at once. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Don't thank me yet, Harold said grimly. Thank me after we win. The call ended, and Emma lowered the phone slowly, looking up at Marcus with something like disbelief written across her face. We might actually be able to do this, she said. We might actually be able to stop him. Marcus's expression stayed cautious, the weight of decades of hard experience keeping his optimism carefully restrained. We might, he agreed. But Richard Cole isn't going to just roll over because an old lawyer found his courage. Men like him don't lose gracefully. The more cornered he feels, the more dangerous he's going to get. As if the universe itself wanted to prove him right. The sound of a car engine pulling up outside cut through the quiet of the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the front of the house before cutting off entirely. Emma's whole body tensed. Marcus moved immediately, positioning himself between her and the front door, one hand raised in a silent signal to the two remaining riders still stationed outside, both of whom straightened instantly, ready for whatever was about to walk through that door. But it wasn't Richard Cole who stepped out of the car. It was a woman, mid-40s, tired-looking, dressed like she'd left work in a hurry, standing hesitantly at the edge of the driveway, glancing nervously between the motorcycles lining the street and the porch where Emma and Marcus stood watching her. "I'm sorry," the woman called out, voice shaking slightly. "I don't mean to intrude. Is this Thomas Walker's house? I heard he passed, and I needed to talk to whoever's handling his affairs. It's important." Emma stepped forward cautiously. "I'm his granddaughter. Can I help you?" The woman's eyes filled with tears almost immediately, her composure cracking under whatever weight she'd been carrying. "My name is Sandra Ruiz," she said. "Danny Ruiz was my son." The name hit Emma like a physical blow. The story Marcus had told her only hours earlier now standing in front of her, painfully, achingly real. "I heard around town Richard Cole's been sniffing around your grandfather's property," Sandra continued, wiping at her eyes. "And I couldn't just sit at home and do nothing. Not after everything your grandfather did for me and my family 30 years ago." Emma's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "Everett Cole killed my son," Sandra said, her voice steadying into a kind of fierce, protective anger despite the tears still falling. "And when nobody else in this town would stand up to him, your grandfather did. He didn't have to. He wasn't family. He barely knew us. But he spent months gathering proof, risking his own business, his own safety, just to make sure Danny's death actually meant something, instead of getting buried under Everett Cole's money the way everything else in this town got buried." She reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out a worn, yellowed folder, holding it out to Emma like an offering. "These are copies of everything I still have," Sandra said. "Old inspection reports, letters your grandfather wrote to the county on my behalf, statements from other tenants who lived in that building before it burned. I kept all of it, all these years, because your grandfather told me it might matter someday." Her voice broke slightly. "I think someday is today." Emma took the folder with hands that weren't quite steady, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what was happening. Strangers, people she'd never met in her entire life, stepping forward one after another to hand her pieces of a fight her grandfather had started decades before she was even born, trusting her, a woman they barely knew, to finish what he'd started. "Thank you," Emma managed, voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Sandra said, offering a small, tired smile through her tears. "Just make sure Richard Cole doesn't win. That's all any of us are asking." As Sandra's car pulled away into the darkness, Emma stood on the porch clutching the folder to her chest, Marcus watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This is bigger than I thought," Emma said quietly. "This isn't just about my grandfather's legacy. This is about everyone he ever protected, everyone Richard Cole and his father ever hurt." "That's exactly what it's about," Marcus said. "And that's exactly why Richard's going to fight this with everything he's got. Because if you win, Emma, it's not just a piece of land you're saving. It's proof laid out for the entire town to see, of exactly what kind of family the Coles really are, and exactly how far your grandfather was willing to go to stop them." Emma looked down at the folder in her hands, then back toward the garage, where her grandfather's hidden safe still sat open. Documents spread across the workbench like evidence in a trial 30 years in the making. "Then we don't have a choice," she said, steel finally creeping into her voice for the first time since this entire nightmare began. "We finish what he started." Marcus nodded slowly, something like respect settling into his weathered features. "Get some sleep tonight if you can," he said, Tomorrow, we start building this properly. The lawyer, the trust claim, all of it. Richard's already shown us he's willing to break into your house and hire people to do his dirty work. From here out, you don't go anywhere alone. Understood? Emma nodded, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the entire terrifying day. But even as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, sleep refused to come easily, her mind cycling endlessly through documents and deadlines and the haunted, grateful look on Sandra Roos's face. She had come to the Iron Road looking for answers about a jacket. She was leaving it as the last line of defense against a man determined to finish what his father had started 30 years ago. The next 4 days moved in a blur Emma never could have prepared for. Harold Whitfield, true to his word, arrived at the county recorder's office the following morning with a briefcase full of documents that made the young clerk's eyes widen the moment he began laying them across the counter. The acknowledgement documents Richard had signed 15 years earlier was exactly as damning as Harold had promised. Richard's own signature staring back at Emma in black ink beneath language that left no room for interpretation. This alone, Harold told her, hands finally steady now that the fear of the previous night had hardened into something closer to determination, proves Richard Cole knew this land was protected. Whatever legal maneuver he's trying now, it doesn't matter. You can't claim ignorance of a trust you signed an acknowledgement for, but knowing something and proving it in a courtroom, Emma quickly learned, were two very different battles. Richard's lawyers moved fast, filing motion after motion designed to delay, confuse, and exhaust anyone standing in their client's way. Twice, Emma sat across a conference table from attorneys in suits worth more than her monthly rent, listening to them calmly explain why the trust language was ambiguous, why the deadline should be interpreted differently, why perhaps it would simply be easier for everyone if Emma accepted a generous cash settlement instead of pursuing what they called an unnecessarily contentious claim. Each time, Emma said no. Each time, she felt her grandfather standing a little more clearly behind her, steady, immovable, refusing to be bought. Marcus and the club never left her alone for more than a few hours at a time. Deacon, who'd been so suspicious of her that first day at the Iron Road, became something close to a shadow, driving her to meetings, standing guard outside Harold's office, his early doubt replaced entirely by a fierce, protective loyalty. Emma found herself grateful for more times than she could count. You proved yourself, he told her gruffly one evening, the fourth night since the safe had been broken into, as they sat outside the county building waiting for Harold to finish filing the last of the necessary paperwork. Where you handled yourself with Cole's lawyers today, where you didn't back down even when they tried to buy you off, he shrugged, looking almost embarrassed by the admission. Tom would have been proud. Emma felt tears prick at her eyes, exhaustion and grief and gratitude tangling together into something she couldn't quite name. Thank you, she said quietly. That means more than you know. But even as the pieces slowly fell into place, the trust claim prepared, the documents verified, the hearing finally scheduled for the 6th and final day, Emma couldn't shake the growing sense that Richard Cole wasn't simply going to lose this fight quietly. She was right. On the morning of the 5th day, with less than 24 hours remaining before the deadline, Emma's phone rang while she sat at her grandfather's kitchen table viewing the final claim documents one last time. Harold on speakerphone beside her. It was Marcus. Emma, he said, and something in his voice made her blood run cold before he'd even finished a sentence. You need to get to the Iron Road right now. What happened? Richard's here, Marcus said grimly. And he's not alone. He brought half the county with him. Reporters, a couple of local officials, even a camera crew. He's standing outside the bar right now telling anyone who'll listen that the club's been running an illegal operation on stolen land for 30 years, and that tomorrow's hearing is nothing but a desperate con job cooked up by a grieving girl and a gang of criminals trying to steal property that rightfully belongs to him. Emma's stomach dropped. He's trying to win in the court of public opinion before we even get to the courthouse. Exactly, Marcus said. "And if he manages to poison the well enough before tomorrow's hearing, it won't matter how solid our paperwork is. Emma, you need to get down here now, because if somebody doesn't stand up and tell the truth in front of those cameras, Richard Cole, I'm about to rewrite 30 years of your grandfather's legacy into a lie the whole county's going to believe." Emma was already grabbing her keys, hands steady despite the fear pounding through her chest, her grandfather's jacket already halfway onto her shoulders before Marcus had even finished speaking. "I'm on my way," she said. "Tell him not to say another word until I get there." The drive to the Iron Road felt like the longest 45 minutes of Emma's entire life, her mind racing through everything she wanted to say, everything Richard Cole had tried to take. From Marcus, from Sandra Ruiz, from a 16-year-old boy who never got the chance to grow up because a rich man didn't want to spend money on safe wiring dots by the time she pulled into the gravel lot. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The scene was exactly as chaotic as Marcus had described. A small crowd gathered outside the bar. A local news van parked at an angle near the entrance, its camera already rolling. And in the center of it all, Richard Cole standing tall and composed in another expensive suit, speaking with the practiced confidence of a man who had never once in his life doubted he'd get exactly what he wanted. A young woman manipulated by opportunists looking to exploit her grief, Richard was saying as Emma approached, voice smooth and reasonable, the picture of a concerned, reluctant businessman other than the predator Emma now knew him to be. "I have nothing but sympathy for Miss Walker's loss, but sympathy doesn't change the legal reality of this situation. This land," Emma said, her voice cutting through the crowd with a strength that surprised even her, "belonged to my grandfather, and you know exactly why he protected it, don't you, Richard?" Every head in the crowd turned. The camera swung immediately toward her. Richard's composed expression flickered, just for a moment, before smoothing back into practiced calm. "Emma," he said, his tone shifting into something gentler, more condescending, the tone of an adult humoring a child. "I understand you're grieving, but this really isn't the place. You knew about Danny Ruiz," Emma said, loud enough for every camera, every reporter, every stunned bystander to hear clearly. "You knew your father let a 16-year-old boy burn to death in a building he refused to fix because it would have cost him money. And you've spent your entire life trying to finish what he started, buying up this town piece by piece, the exact same way he did, except you learned to hide it better." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The reporter holding the microphone took a half-step closer, sensing a much bigger story unfolding than the one she'd shown up expecting. "That's a serious accusation," Richard said, jaw tightening, the first genuine crack Emma had seen in his composure since he'd first shown up on her porch. "One you have absolutely no proof of." Emma reached into her bag and pulled out Sandra Ruiz's folder, along with the copy of the acknowledgement document Harold had produced, holding both up high enough for the camera to catch clearly. "I have inspection reports your father paid an inspector to falsify," Emma said, voice unwavering despite the adrenaline crushing through her. "I have your own signature on a legal document proving you knew this land was protected under an irrevocable trust 15 years ago, which means everything you're doing right now is deliberate fraud, not some honest legal misunderstanding. And I have Sandra Ruiz, Danny's mother, ready to tell anyone who'll listen exactly what your family took from her." Richard's face had gone pale beneath his composed exterior, eyes darting briefly toward the camera, then toward the crowd now watching him with an entirely different kind of attention than they had only moments before. "You're twisting the truth," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Am I?" Emma asked. "Then let's find out tomorrow, in court, in front of a judge, instead of out here, where you're hoping a camera crew and a few nervous local officials will do your fighting for you." The reporter turned toward Richard, microphone extended, clearly waiting for a response to the accusations just leveled on live camera. Richard opened his mouth, hesitated, and for the first time since Emma had met him, seemed entirely unsure of what to say next. Behind Emma, Marcus stepped forward, along with a dozen other club members who had gathered silently throughout the confrontation, forming a wall behind her that needed no words to communicate exactly where their loyalty stood. "Tomorrow," Marcus said, voice carrying easily across the tense silence. "Everyone's going to see exactly what kind of man you are, Richard. Just like everyone saw exactly what kind of man your father was, right before the state locked him up for the rest of his life." Richard's composure finally shattered completely, something raw and furious flashing across his face before he caught himself, forcing his expression back towards something resembling calm. "This isn't over," he said quietly, low enough that only Emma and Marcus, standing closest, could hear. "No," Emma agreed, voice steady despite the tremor still running through her hands. "It's not, but tomorrow it will be. And you're going to lose, Richard, just like you should have known you would. The moment you decided to threaten a grieving woman standing in her grandfather's kitchen." Richard held her gaze a long, tense moment, something calculating and furious burning behind his eyes, before finally turning and pushing through the crowd toward his car without another word, the reporter's questions trailing uselessly behind him. The moment his car disappeared down the road, the tension holding the crowd rippled into something else entirely. Murmurs of shock. A few scattered questions shouted toward Emma and Marcus, the reporter already turning back toward the camera to deliver an update to a story that had just exploded in front of her. Emma stood there, breathing hard, her grandfather's jacket heavy on her shoulders, the folder of evidence still clutched tight in trembling hands. She had done it. She had stood in front of cameras, in front of strangers, in front of the man who had threatened her home and tried to steal her grandfather's legacy, and she hadn't backed down. Marcus stepped up beside her, expression somewhere between pride and exhaustion, voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "Your grandfather would have been so proud of you right now, Emma. I hope you know that." Emma felt tears finally breaking free, the adrenaline of the last few minutes giving way to something rawer, more overwhelming. "We still have tomorrow," she said, wiping at her eyes. "This isn't over yet." "No," Marcus agreed, glancing toward the road where Richard's car had vanished, expression darkening with a warning Emma felt all the way to her bones. "It isn't. And after what just happened here, I don't think Richard Cole is going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow quietly. Men like him don't lose in public and just accept it." Emma barely slept that night. She lay in her grandfather's house, the jacket draped over the chair exactly the way it had been the first night she found it, staring at the ceiling, running through everything Harold had prepared, everything Sandra had given her, everything Marcus had promised the club would bring to the courthouse in the morning. 6 days had felt impossible when Marcus first told her the deadline. Now she had less than 12 hours, and every version of tomorrow her mind conjured ended one of two ways. Either she stood in that courtroom and finally finished what her grandfather started, or Richard Cole found some final, desperate way to make sure she never got the chance. Her phone buzzed just after midnight. Harold's name lit up the screen, and Emma answered before the first ring even finished. "Mr. Whitfield, is everything okay?" "I need you to listen to me very carefully," Harold said, and something in his tone sent a fresh wave of dread crawling up Emma's spine. "I just got off the phone with a colleague in the clerk's office. Richard's lawyers filed an emergency motion 20 minutes ago requesting the hearing be moved up to 7 tomorrow." Emma sat bolt upright. "That's in 7 hours." "I know. Can they even do that?" "Technically, yes," Harold said, exhaustion straining his voice. "It's an aggressive move, clearly designed to catch us off guard, to make sure we don't have time to properly prepare our witnesses or gather anyone else who might come forward. Richard's hoping, if he moves fast enough, we show up disorganized and the judge sides with whoever looks more prepared." Emma's mind raced. Can Sandra get there in time? Can Marcus? "I already called Sandra. She's coming. I don't know about Marcus and the others. That's on you to reach out tonight. But Emma, there's something else you need to know." "What?" Harold hesitated, and the silence stretched just long enough for Emma's stomach to twist into a knot. "The judge assigned to this hearing, he said finally, "is a man named Preston Marsh. And 2 years ago, Richard Cole's development company donated $50,000 to Judge Marsh's re-election campaign. The floor dropped out from beneath Emma, all over again. You're telling me the judge is bought? I'm telling you we need to assume he might be sympathetic to Richard's side, and prepare accordingly. Our case has to be airtight. No gaps, no hesitation. Nothing Richard's lawyers can twist into reasonable doubt, because if this judge is looking for any excuse to rule in Richard's favor, we cannot give him one." Emma pressed a hand against her chest, willing her heart to slow, willing herself to think clearly instead of drowning in panic. "Okay," she said, forcing steel into her voice even as fear clawed at its edges. "Then we don't give him one. I'll call Marcus right now." She hung up and dialed immediately, hands trembling as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times before he picked up, voice thick with sleep that vanished the instant she explained what Harold had told her. 7 o'clock, Marcus repeated, and Emma heard rustling on the other end, the unmistakable sound of a man already moving, already pulling on clothes despite the hour. "That's barely any warning at all. He's trying to bury us before we even walk through the door. Harold thinks the judge might be in Richard's pocket," Emma added, the words feeling heavier each time she said them. Marcus was quiet a moment. "Then we make sure the courtroom's too full of witnesses and evidence for even a bored judge to ignore. I'm calling Deacon right now. We'll be at your place within the hour, and we're not leaving your side until this is over." "Understood. Understood," Emma whispered, gratitude and terror tangling together in her chest. The next several hours blurred together in a haze of frantic preparation. Marcus and Deacon arriving just before 2 in the morning, headlights sweeping across the front of the house as a dozen motorcycles lined the street outside. Harold arriving shortly after with a briefcase full of reorganized documents, his reading glasses perched crookily as he worked through the night, reviewing every page for anything Richard's lawyers might try to exploit. Sandra Ruiz calling twice to confirm she was still coming, her voice steadier each time, despite the early hour dot by 5 in the morning. Emma sat at her grandfather's kitchen table, the same table where she'd first read his letter only a week earlier, surrounded by people who had somehow, impossibly, become her family across 6 exhausting, terrifying days. "You ready?" Marcus asked quietly, watching her from across the table. Emma looked down at the jacket on her shoulders, at the folder of evidence in front of her, at the faces of people who had risked everything to stand beside a stranger simply because she carried the right name and the right patch. "No," she admitted honestly, "but I'm going anyway." Marcus's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but came close. "That's exactly what your grandfather would have said." He stood. "Let's go." The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty when they arrived just before 6:30. The early morning sky still holding on to the last traces of darkness, the air carrying that particular desert chill that never fully leaves, even in summer. Emma climbed out of her car and immediately felt the weight of Marcus and Deacon falling into step either side of her. A dozen more club members parking their bikes in careful formation across the lot. An unmistakable show of unity that made her throat tighten with gratitude. Richard Cole was already there, standing near the courthouse entrance, flanked by 2 lawyers in identical charcoal suits, his expression composed and confident in a way that made Emma's stomach twist with fresh doubt. If moving the hearing up 7 hours had rattled him at all, he wasn't showing it. "Emma," he said as she approached, voice carrying that same practiced warmth he'd used the very first day he showed up on her porch. "I hope you got some sleep. Big day. I hope you did too," Emma replied evenly, refusing to let him see how exhausted she actually was. "Considering how hard you worked to make sure I wouldn't." Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite anger, but close, before he turned and walked through the courthouse doors without another word. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than Emma expected, wood-paneled, quiet, the kind of room that had probably decided 100 small-town disputes long before this one. Judge Preston Marsh sat already at the bench when they entered, A stern-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perched low on his nose, his expression giving nothing away as he watched both parties settle into their seats. Emma sat beside Harold at one table. Richard sat with his lawyers at the other. Behind Emma, the gallery slowly filled. Marcus, Deacon, a dozen more club members, Sandra Ruiz arriving just in time to slip into a seat near the back, her presence alone giving Emma a fresh surge of resolve. "This court is now in session," the judge announced, voice flat and businesslike. "We're here regarding an emergency petition filed by Cole Development Group, disputing the validity of a trust claim submitted by Emma Walker, granddaughter and sole heir of the late Thomas Walker. Counsel for Mr. Cole, you may proceed." Richard's lead attorney rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. "Thank you, Your Honor. This is, at its core, a simple matter. Mr. Walker's trust required formal claim by a blood descendant within 1 calendar year of his death, with specific conditions regarding documentation and timing that Miss Walker has failed to satisfy. My client has held legitimate mineral and mortgage rights to this property for over a decade, rights that default to him the moment those conditions go unmet." He gestured toward a stack of papers. "We've reviewed Miss Walker's submitted claim thoroughly, Your Honor, and found significant gaps in the chain of custody for several key documents, gaps that call into question the authenticity of the entire trust filing." Emma's stomach dropped. She glanced at Harold, whose expression remained carefully neutral despite the tension she could feel radiating off him. "Objection isn't necessary yet," Harold murmured under his breath. "Let him finish. We'll address every point." The attorney continued for several more minutes, laying out a methodical argument designed to paint Emma's claim as rushed, poorly documented, and legally insufficient. Nothing overtly false, Emma realized with growing unease, but every fact twisted and framed in exactly the light most damaging to her case. When he finally sat down, Judge Marsh turned toward Harold. "Counsel for Miss Walker, your response." Harold rose slowly. His earlier fear from that terrified phone call from nights ago, where to be found, replaced instead by a quiet, steady confidence that reminded Emma he'd spent decades in courtrooms just like this one before retiring. "Your Honor," he began. "Opposing counsel's argument rests entirely on the premise that Miss Walker's documentation is incomplete or improperly authenticated. I'd like to submit into evidence a document signed by Richard Cole himself 15 years ago, formally acknowledging the existence and validity of the very trust he now claims is invalid." A visible ripple went through the courtroom. Richard's expression didn't change, but Emma saw his hand tighten almost imperceptibly around his pen. Harold approached the bench, handing the document to the judge, who read it slowly, expression unreadable. "This is Mr. Cole's signature." "It is," Richard's attorney admitted stiffly, clearly not having anticipated this document surfacing. "However, Your Honor, an acknowledgement of a trust's existence 15 years ago does not necessarily speak to its current validity, particularly given the substantial gaps in it speaks," Harold interrupted, voice sharpening, "to the fact that your client has known for 15 years exactly what this trust required, and exactly what conditions would trigger the property defaulting into his hands, which means, Your Honor, that every action Mr. Cole has taken over the past week, pressuring Miss Walker to abandon her claim, hiring an individual to break into her grandfather's home and steal supporting documentation, moving up this very hearing with less than 7 hours' notice, was not the behavior of a man confused about legal ambiguity. It was the calculated behavior of a man who knew precisely how to exploit a grieving woman's unfamiliarity with her own inheritance. The courtroom went utterly silent. Richard's composed expression finally cracked, jaw tightening as murmurs rippled through the gallery. "Your Honor," Richard's attorney said quickly, "these are serious accusations without proof." Harold cut in smoothly. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness." Judge Marsh nodded slowly, still studying the acknowledgement document in his hands. "Proceed." Harold turned, and Emma watched Sandra Ruiz rise from her seat in the gallery. Walking forward with a composure that seemed to grow stronger with every step toward the witness stand. "Please state your name for the record." "Sandra Ruiz." "Mrs. Ruiz, can you tell the court about your son, Danny?" Sandra's voice trembled slightly as she began, but she didn't stop, didn't waver, didn't let emotion overwhelm the steady clarity of her testimony. She spoke about the fire, about Everett Cole's ignored warnings, about the years of silence that followed, the fear that kept an entire town from speaking up, and the one mechanic who refused to let a rich man's negligence disappear into forgotten history. "Thomas Walker gave me a voice," Sandra said, tears finally slipping down her cheeks, "when everyone else in this town was too afraid to. And now his granddaughter is standing here, fighting the same family for the same reasons. And I refused to stay silent again." Richard's attorney rose for cross-examination, attempting to poke holes in Sandra's memory, in the timeline, in the emotional weight of her testimony. But every question only seemed to strengthen her resolve rather than shake it, her answers growing steadier and more precise with each attempt to rattle her dots. By the time Sandra stepped down, Emma could see something shifting in Judge Marsh's expression, a crack in the careful neutrality he'd maintained since the hearing began. "Your Honor," Harold said, "I'd like to submit into evidence the original inspection reports proving Everett Cole knew about the fire hazard that killed Danny Ruiz, along with documentation showing a pattern of similar negligence across multiple properties currently owned by Cole Development Group under Richard Cole's leadership." Richard's attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is entirely outside the scope of today's hearing, which concerns a property trust dispute, not decades-old allegations against my client's late father." "It's directly relevant," Harold countered, "because it establishes motive and pattern. Mr. Cole isn't simply pursuing a legitimate business claim. Your Honor, he's attempting to seize land specifically because it represents the last remaining obstacle to erasing his family's history of negligence and exploitation in this county. The urgency of his legal maneuvers, the intimidation tactics used against Miss Walker, the emergency motion filed in the middle of the night, all of it speaks to a man desperate to bury the truth before it resurfaces." Judge Marsh held up a hand, silencing both attorneys. "I'll allow limited testimony on this point. Continue, Counselor, but stay focused." Harold nodded and turned toward Emma. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my final witness, Emma Walker herself." Emma's heart pounded as she rose and walked toward the witness stand, every eye in the courtroom following her. Richard's cold, calculating gaze the heaviest of all. She sat, placed her hand on the small Bible the bailiff offered, and took the oath with a steadiness that surprised her. "Miss Walker," Harold began gently, "can you tell the court what happened the day you found your grandfather's jacket?" Emma took a breath and began to speak, not just about the jacket, but about everything. The letter, Richard's threats on her porch, the break-in at the garage, the safe hidden beneath the concrete floor, protecting 30 years of evidence her grandfather had gathered against a family determined to control an entire town through fear and money. She spoke about Marcus, about the club rallying around her without hesitation, about Harold's midnight phone call warning her of danger before she even understood what she was walking into, about Sandra Ruiz driving to a stranger's house in the middle of the night simply because she couldn't bear to watch history repeat itself in silence. "My grandfather," Emma said, voice steady despite the tears finally slipping free, "spent his entire life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He built this trust, hid this jacket, gathered 30 years of evidence, not because he wanted a fight, but because he knew someday somebody would need it. He knew Richard Cole would come looking eventually, and he made sure that when that day came, the truth would be ready to meet him." She looked directly at Richard for the first time since taking the stand. "You didn't just try to take a piece of land from me," she said. "You tried to erase everything my grandfather spent his life protecting, and I refuse to let you finish what your father started." The courtroom was utterly silent. Richard's attorney rose for cross-examination, questions sharp and probing, hunting for any inconsistency, any crack he could exploit. But Emma held steady through every question, her grandfather's calm certainty somehow settling into her own voice with every answer. After nearly 20 minutes, the attorney sat back down. Clearly unable to shake anything loose, Judge Marsh removed his reading glasses, rubbing at his eyes for a long moment before finally speaking. "I'm going to call a brief recess," he announced. Before rendering my decision, the courtroom emptied into the hallway, tension crackling through every conversation, every anxious glance toward the closed doors. Marcus found Emma immediately, pulling her into a brief, fierce hug that nearly knocked the breath out of her. "You did it," he said. "No matter what happens next, you did exactly what your grandfather would have wanted. You told the truth in front of everyone, and you didn't back down." "It's not over yet," Emma said, though something in her chest had loosened slightly for the first time in days. "No," Marcus agreed, "but whatever that judge decides in there, everyone in this hallway just heard the truth. Richard can't take that back, no matter which way this ruling goes." 20 minutes later, the bailiff called them back inside, and Emma took her seat beside Harold, heart hammering so violently she could barely hear her own thoughts over the sound of it. Judge Marsh entered, taking his seat at the bench with the same unreadable expression he'd worn throughout the entire hearing, and Emma braced herself for whatever came next. "This has been," the judge began slowly, "one of the more unusual cases to cross my bench in quite some time." He paused, glancing briefly toward Richard's table. "Mr. Cole's petition rests on a technical interpretation of trust conditions that, on its surface, might have merit under different circumstances. However, the evidence presented today establishes quite clearly a pattern of deliberate intimidation, obstruction, and fraud on the part of the petitioner, dating back at minimum 15 years and potentially much longer." Emma's breath caught. The acknowledgement document signed by Mr. Cole demonstrates an ambiguous prior knowledge of this trust's validity, the judge continued, combined with testimony establishing a credible pattern of harassment against Miss Walker during the claim period. This court finds that any technical delays in formal filing were substantially caused by the petitioner's own unlawful interference, and therefore cannot be held against the respondent. Richard's face had gone completely pale. "Furthermore," Judge Marsh said, voice hardening, "given the evidence presented regarding Cole Development Group's documented history of negligence and the credible allegations of witness intimidation and criminal trespass connected to this case, I am referring this matter to the County District Attorney's Office for a further investigation." A wave of stunned murmurs swept through the gallery. "This court finds in favor of the respondent," Judge Marsh announced. "Emma Walker's trust claim is hereby formally recognized and protected under its original terms. Mr. Cole's petition is denied in its entirety." The gavel struck once, sharp and final, and the sound echoed through Emma's chest, like something breaking open after being held too tight for far too long. Behind her, Marcus let out a low, fierce exhale that might have been relief or triumph, or both, while Deacon actually laughed out loud, quickly muffling the sound with his hand. Sandra Ruiz was crying openly now, hand pressed to her mouth. 30 years of grief and helplessness finally given somewhere to land. Richard sat frozen at his table, lawyers already whispering urgently beside him, but Emma barely registered any of it, her whole body flooding with a relief so overwhelming it left her momentarily unable to move. She had done it. Her grandfather's legacy was safe. Slowly, Emma turned in her seat and found Richard watching her, his earlier confidence completely stripped away, replaced by something raw and furious, and underneath it all, unmistakably afraid. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, voice barely audible over the celebratory murmur filling the courtroom. "You think a judge's ruling protects you. You have no idea what you just started." "Emma." Before Emma could respond, Marcus stepped up beside her, presence immediate and unmistakable, eyes locked on Richard with a warning that needed no words. "Actually," Marcus said, low and steady, "I think it's you who has no idea what you just finished, Richard. 30 years of your family trying to control this town through fear, and today, in front of everyone, it finally caught up with you." Richard's jaw tightened, but for the first time Since Emma had met him, he had no smooth response ready. He simply gathered his papers, nodded stiffly to his attorneys, and walked out of the courtroom without another word, the door swinging shut behind him with a finality that felt like the closing of an entirely different chapter than the one that had just begun for Emma. Outside the courthouse, the desert sun had risen fully now, warm and bright against a cloudless sky. Emma stood on the steps, surrounded by the people who had fought alongside her through this impossible week. Marcus, steady and quiet with pride he didn't need to voice aloud. Deacon, grinning despite himself. Harold, looking years younger than he had 4 nights ago, when fear had first cracked his careful silence. Sandra Ruiz, finally, after 3 decades, allowing herself something that looked almost like peace. Emma looked down at the jacket on her shoulders, the worn leather, the faded patch that had started this entire impossible journey, and felt her grandfather's presence settle over her like something warm and certain. He knew, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. He knew this day would come, and he made sure I'd be ready for it. Even though I didn't understand any of it at the time. Marcus placed a steady hand on her shoulder, voice quiet, but full of something Emma could only describe as pride. He didn't just prepare you for today, Emma. He trusted you with everything he built, and you didn't just protect his legacy, you proved you deserved to carry it forward. Emma looked out at the small crowd still gathered on the courthouse steps, at the motorcycles lining the lot, at a town that had spent a week watching a grieving granddaughter transform into something far stronger than anyone, including Emma herself, had ever expected. The fight wasn't entirely over. She understood that now, understood that men like Richard Cole rarely disappeared quietly, no matter how thoroughly they lost. But for the first time since she'd found that hidden jacket behind her grandfather's old work clothes, Emma felt something settle deep in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel again so soon after burying the only family she had left. She felt like she finally understood exactly who Thomas Walker had been, and standing there in his jacket, surrounded by the family he'd built long before she was ever born. She felt like she finally understood exactly who she was meant to become. Richard's threat should have rattled Emma more than it did. Standing on those courthouse steps, jacket heavy on her shoulders, she felt something steadier than fear settle into her chest, a quiet certainty that came from finally understanding exactly what she was fighting for, and exactly who was standing beside her while she did it. But steady didn't mean naive. He's not just going to walk away, Emma said, watching Richard's car pull out of the lot, tires screeching slightly against the asphalt, in a way that betrayed the calm exterior he'd tried so hard to maintain inside that courtroom. Men like that don't lose gracefully. You said so yourself. Marcus's expression darkened, eyes following the same disappearing car. No, they don't, which is why we're not going anywhere just yet. They didn't have to wait long to find out how right he was. 3 days after the ruling, Emma's phone rang, just after sunrise. Harold's name lit up the screen with an urgency that made her stomach clench before she even answered. Emma, he said, and she could hear something different in his voice. Not fear exactly, but a kind of grim satisfaction that immediately put her on alert. You need to turn on the news. Emma fumbled for the remote, hands still clumsy with sleep, and clicked on the small television in her grandfather's living room, just in time to see a local reporter standing outside a building she didn't recognize. County sheriff's vehicles lined up behind her in the parking lot. Breaking news out of Red Valley this morning, the reporter was saying. County investigators have executed a search warrant at the corporate offices of Cole Development Group, following what sources describe as a criminal referral stemming from a civil trust dispute earlier this week. Emma's breath caught. Preliminary reports suggest investigators are looking into allegations of witness intimidation, criminal trespass, and a pattern of fraudulent business practices dating back over a decade. Richard Cole, CEO of Cole Development Group, has not yet issued a statement. Emma sat frozen on the edge of the couch, watching footage of investigators carrying boxes out of a sleek glass building. Disbelief and something close to vindication tangling together in her chest. They're actually doing something. She breathed into the phone. The DA's office is actually investigating him. They are, Harold confirmed, and Emma could hear exhaustion and relief mixing in his voice. 30 years of silence, finally cracking open into something resembling justice. And Emma, once investigators start pulling at one thread on a man like Richard Cole, they tend to find a whole lot more than they expected. He wasn't wrong. Over the following week, the story grew faster than Emma could have imagined. Each new headline peeling back another layer of a decade Richard had spent very carefully constructing to look nothing like what it actually was. Former employees came forward. Contractors who'd been strong-armed into silence over shoddy safety violations started talking to reporters. A county building inspector from the same office that had once been bribed to cover up Everett Cole's negligence decades earlier was suddenly under scrutiny after records surfaced, showing similar irregularities tied to properties Richard currently owned. Emma watched it all unfold from her grandfather's living room, feeling less like a victor and more like someone who had simply pulled one loose thread that the whole town had been too afraid to touch for 30 years. "It's not just you," Marcus told her one evening, sitting across from her at the same kitchen table where this entire nightmare had first started with a hidden letter and an old leather jacket. "People have been waiting for somebody brave enough to go first. You didn't just win your case, Emma. You gave this whole town permission to stop being afraid." Emma wanted to believe that. Some days she almost did, but other days, exhaustion and grief still crept in sideways, catching her off guard in the quiet moments. Reaching for the phone to call her grandfather about something small before remembering all over again that he was gone. Sitting at his workbench in the garage, running her fingers over tools he'd used for 40 years. Missing him with an ache no courtroom victory could fully soften. It was on one of those quieter, harder evenings, nearly 2 weeks after the ruling, that Marcus showed up at her door unannounced, his expression carrying something Emma hadn't seen from him before. A kind of nervous uncertainty that looked strange on a man who, in every other moment she'd known him, radiated absolute steadiness. "I need to show you something," he said. "Something I probably should have told you the very first day you walked into that bar." Emma's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Marcus hesitated at the door, and for a moment Emma genuinely wondered if he was about to walk away without answering. "It's easier if I just show you," he said instead. "Get your jacket. We're going back to the Iron Road." The drive out felt different this time. The first trip weeks earlier had been soaked in fear and uncertainty. Emma gripping the wheel with white knuckles, terrified of what waited for her at the end of that gravel road. This time, watching the familiar shapes of the desert roll past her window, Emma felt something closer to peace, even wrapped around the mystery of whatever Marcus still hadn't told her. The bar looked exactly the same it had that first day, bikes lined up outside, low music drifting from somewhere inside the same worn wooden door that had once felt like the entrance to another world entirely. Now it felt like coming home. Deacon greeted her with an easy nod as she walked in, no longer the suspicious stranger who once demanded proof of who she claimed to be, but someone who belonged, someone the whole room had watched fight for a legacy that belonged to all of them. Marcus led her past the bar, past the pool table, toward a small back office Emma had never seen before, its door slightly ajar, revealing a cramped space stacked with old boxes and yellowed paperwork. "This was your grandfather's office," Marcus said quietly, stepping aside to let her enter first. "Back when he ran this chapter, I never touched it after he stepped back from the club. Never had the heart to." Emma stepped inside slowly, eyes moving over old photographs pinned to a corkboard on the wall. Her grandfather, decades younger, surrounded by men whose faces she didn't recognize, all of them wearing the same patch she now wore herself, all of them smiling in a way that suggested a joy Emma had rarely seen from the quiet, careful man who raised her. "He looks happy here," she said softly. "He was," Marcus said. "This club was his family before you were born, Emma. And when your parents passed and he took you in, He made a choice most men in his position wouldn't have made. Emma turned, sensing the weight building behind Marcus's words. What choice? Marcus walked further into the small office, pulling open a drawer in an old filing cabinet, retrieving a single worn photograph, which he handed to her without a word. Emma looked down at it, and her breath caught entirely. It was her grandfather, younger than in any photo she'd ever seen of him, standing beside a woman Emma had never met, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, holding an infant wrapped in a soft blanket. "Who is this?" Emma asked, though something in her chest already suspected the answer before Marcus spoke it. "That's your grandmother," Marcus said quietly. "And that's your mother. The day she was born." Emma's hands trembled slightly, holding a photograph of a family history she'd never once seen documented anywhere in her entire life. "He stepped back from the club the day your mother was born," Marcus continued. "Told all of us he couldn't keep living two lives. One as a father, one as a man riding with an outlaw patch on his back. No matter how much good that patch had done for this town, he chose to be Tom Walker the mechanic. Quiet, steady, safe. He gave up this entire world, Emma, the second he became a father, because he refused to let the dangerous parts of his past ever touch the family he was building." Emma stared at the photograph, tears blurring the edges of her vision. "That's why he never told me," she whispered. "It wasn't shame. He wasn't hiding something ugly. He was protecting me, just like he protected everyone else." "Exactly," Marcus said, voice thick with emotion he rarely let show. "He built the safest, quietest life he possibly could for you and your mother, and later, just for you, after everything happened to your parents. He never wanted you carrying the weight of this world, unless you absolutely had to." He paused. "But he also never wanted you growing up not knowing where you came from. That's why he left the jacket. That's why he left my name. He knew someday you'd need to understand exactly who you were, and exactly what kind of strength ran through your blood." Emma pressed the photograph to her chest, overwhelmed by grief and gratitude tangled together into something almost too large to hold. "He gave up everything for us," she said. "His whole world, his whole identity. And he never once complained about it. Not one single day in 30 years, Marcus said. Because being your grandfather, Emma, mattered more to him than any patch or any legacy ever could." Emma stood there in that small, dusty office, surrounded by photographs of a life she'd never known existed, and felt something inside her finally settle completely into place. Not just an understanding of who her grandfather had been, but a deeper, more complete understanding of who she was because of him. The peace of that moment didn't last long. Emma's phone buzzed sharply in her pocket, cutting through the quiet reverence of the office, and she pulled it out to find Harold's name flashing across the screen again, his tone immediately urgent the moment she answered. "Emma, you need to come to my office right now," he said. "There's been a development. A big one." "What happened?" "Richard's been arrested," Harold said, and Emma felt the whole room seem to tilt slightly around her. "Formal charges this time. Fraud, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice. They're building a case that goes back years." "Emma, this isn't a slap on the wrist. This is real." Emma gripped the door frame, steadying herself against the sheer weight of relief crashing through her all at once. "Is it over?" she asked, almost afraid to hope. "Is it actually over?" Harold's voice softened. "For Richard Cole, personally, I think it's about to be a very long road, and not the kind that ends in another victory lap. For you, Emma, yes, I think it's finally, truly over." Marcus, listening beside her, exhaled slowly, a decade of tension seeming to release from his shoulders all at once. "Your grandfather's fight," he said quietly, "just ended 30 years after it started, because you refused to let it stay buried." Emma hung up the phone, tears finally slipping free without any effort to stop them. Relief and grief and pride crashing over her in waves too large to separate from one another. She thought of Danny Ruiz, gone 30 years too soon. She thought of Sandra, finally allowed to grieve without the added weight of injustice sitting on her chest. She thought of Harold, finding courage after decades of careful, frightened silence, and she thought of her grandfather, a quiet mechanic who mowed his lawn every Saturday and never once raised his voice, who had spent his entire life protecting a town that never fully understood exactly how much they owed him. He'd be proud, Marcus said softly, watching her carefully. Not because you won in a courtroom, Emma, because of who you became along the way. The weeks that followed unfolded slower, gentler, in a way Emma hadn't experienced since the moment she first opened that closet door and found a hidden jacket behind her grandfather's old work clothes. The formal charges against Richard Cole continued building, the investigation widening far beyond anything Emma had anticipated. Cole Development Group's assets were frozen pending trial. Several of Richard's business partners quietly severed ties, unwilling to be tangled up in a scandal threatening to consume everything he'd spent his life constructing. The land, the water rights, the decade of quiet manipulation, all of it slowly unraveling under the weight of her truth Thomas Walker had spent 30 years carefully preserving. For exactly this moment, the Iron Road remained exactly where it had always been, safe and protected under the trust Emma had fought to preserve. Its gravel lot filling every weekend with the same rumble of engines that had first stopped Emma's heart the day she walked through its doors as a terrified stranger. She wasn't a stranger there anymore. She drove out most weekends now, sitting at the same corner table where Marcus had first told her the truth about her grandfather, listening to old stories from men who had known Thomas Walker decades before she was born, piecing together, conversation by conversation, an entire history that had somehow remained invisible to her for her entire life. He fixed my truck for free the year the wife got sick, one older rider told her one evening, voice rough with old gratitude. Wouldn't take a dime, said family didn't charge family. He taught me to read, said another, a quiet man named Ellis, whom Emma had barely spoken to before that night. 41 years old. And your grandfather sat with me every Tuesday night for a year until I could finally read a book cover to cover on my own. Never made me feel small about it. Not once. Story after story, night after night, Emma began to understand the true shape of the legacy she'd inherited. Not power, not fear, not the kind of controlling influence Richard Cole and his father had spent their lives chasing, but something far more enduring. Loyalty, freely given, and just as freely returned. It was nearly a month after the ruling, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, that Emma finally decided what to do with the house. She'd been turning the idea over 4 weeks, ever since that first night going through her grandfather's things, unable to shake the feeling that a house this full of quiet, careful protection deserved to keep serving that same purpose long after she was the only one left to carry it forward. She called Marcus first. I want to open the house up, she told him, not live in it alone, surrounded by everything he built, doing nothing with it. I want it to be somewhere people can come, the way people used to come to him. When they needed help nobody else would give them. Marcus was quiet a moment on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, Emma could hear something thick with emotion beneath his usually steady voice. You want to build a version of what he built, he said, for people who need somewhere safe to land. Exactly, Emma said. A place for people going through what I went through. Grief, confusion, not knowing where to turn. She paused. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but I know I don't want this house to just sit here, quiet and empty, holding on to a legacy nobody gets to benefit from anymore. Then let's build it, Marcus said simply. Whatever you need, Emma. The club's behind you. We always will be. Over the following months, Emma turned her grandfather's house from a quiet grieving space into something new, a small community resource center, modest at first, offering meals and support to struggling families, veterans, elderly neighbors who needed someone willing to check in on them the way Thomas Walker once had, quietly and without fanfare. For decades before anyone thought to properly thank him for it, Sandra Ruiz became one of the first regular volunteers, spending her Wednesday afternoons helping Emma organize donated supplies, The two of them slowly building a friendship they had expected, but both had desperately needed. "Your grandfather," Sandra told her one afternoon, folding a stack of donated blankets with practiced efficiency, "used to say the measure of a man isn't how loud he is when things are good. It's how quiet and steady he stays when things fall apart." She smiled softly. "You're exactly like him, Emma, whether you realize it yet or not." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. The ache of missing her grandfather never fully disappearing, but softening now into something gentler, something she was learning to carry rather than simply survive. The old leather jacket hung near the front door of the house now, exactly where anyone walking through could see it clearly, not locked away in a closet, not hidden behind old work clothes waiting decades to be discovered, but visible, present, a quiet reminder to everyone who walks through that door of exactly what one person's steady, patient courage could build, even in a town that had spent decades too afraid to speak up against the people trying to control it. Marcus came by often, sometimes just to check in, sometimes bringing other members of the club to help with repairs around the property. The same men who had once looked at Emma with suspicion in a smoky bar, now treating her like family without a second thought. "You know," Deacon told her one afternoon, hammering a loose board back into place on the porch, "when you first walked into that bar wearing Tom's jacket, half of us thought you were some con artist trying to scam a dying legend's reputation." Emma laughed softly. "I remember. You weren't exactly subtle about it." "Yeah, well," Deacon shrugged, a rare smile tugging at his weathered face. "Glad I was wrong. Tom would have been proud of what you're building here, proud of the woman you turned out to be." It was late autumn, nearly 6 months after Emma first found that jacket hidden in her grandfather's closet, when Marcus found her sitting alone on the porch one evening, watching the sun sink slowly behind the desert horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded her unexpectedly of the warmth in her grandfather's kitchen on quiet Sunday mornings. He sat down beside her without a word, the two of them settling into the comfortable, easy silence that had grown between them over the past several months. "I got a call today," Marcus said finally. "Richard's trial date is set, February. From what Harold tells me, the case against him is about as solid as they come. He's not walking away from this one, Emma, not this time." Emma nodded slowly, feeling something settle deep in her chest, not triumph exactly, but something closer to closure. "I'm glad," she said honestly, "not because I want to see him suffer, because I want this town to finally be free of what his family spent 30 years building on top of it." Marcus glanced sideways at her, something thoughtful passing behind his weathered eyes. "You've changed," he said, "since that first day you walked into the bar. I don't just mean stronger, though you're definitely that too. You carry yourself different now, like you finally understand exactly where you belong." Emma considered that for a long moment, watching the last of the sunlight fade slowly behind the mountains in the distance. "I used to think I was alone," she admitted quietly. "After my parents died, after it was just me and my grandfather, I always felt like family was this fragile, small thing that could disappear at any moment. The way it had disappeared for me before." She paused. "I didn't understand, until all of this happened, that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who show up, over and over, without being asked, simply because it's the right thing to do." Marcus's expression softened into something Emma hadn't seen from him before, a kind of quiet, fatherly pride that made her chest ache with gratitude. "Your grandfather spent his whole life protecting people," he said. "Now you understand why he trusted you with that jacket." Emma smiled, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, but no longer carrying the same sharp grief they once had. Instead, they felt like something gentler, something closer to peace. "I understand it completely now," she said softly. Marcus rose slowly from the porch steps, preparing to head back to his bike, but paused at the top of the stairs, looking back at her one final time with something warm and certain in his gaze. "The club's not going anywhere, Emma," he said. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it, that's not going to change. Not now, not ever." "I know," Emma said, and she meant it completely. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything. Don't thank me," he said, echoing words Emma remembered from months earlier, in a very different, much more frightened conversation. "Thank your grandfather. He's the one who built all of this. I just kept his promise." Emma watched him climb onto his bike and disappear down the quiet road, the sound of his engine fading slowly into the evening stillness, and sat alone on the porch for a long while afterward, simply breathing in the quiet peace of a life she never could have imagined for herself 6 months earlier. She thought about the frightened, grieving woman who had first opened that closet door, certain she was about to find nothing more than old clothes and forgotten memories. She thought about the terrified drive to the iron road, certain she was walking into danger she couldn't possibly understand. She thought about Richard Cole's cold voice on her porch, warning her to take off a jacket that carried nothing but love and protection disguised for 30 years as an old, forgotten secret. And she thought, finally, about her grandfather, not as a man hiding some dangerous, complicated past, but as exactly who he had always been underneath every careful layer of protection he built around her. A protector, a quiet, steady man who spent his entire life making sure the people around him were safe, cared for, and never, ever alone. Even if that meant sacrificing an entire identity, an entire community, an entire brotherhood he clearly loved, simply to give his daughter and granddaughter the safest, gentlest life he possibly could. Emma rose from the porch steps as the last light faded fully from the sky, walking back inside the house that had once felt so unbearably empty, now filled instead with donated blankets and volunteer schedules and photographs of a family history finally brought fully into the light. She paused by the front door, where the old leather jacket still hung exactly where it belonged, worn leather catching the soft glow of the porch light through the window. She reached out and touched it gently, the way she had that very first day in the closet, though everything about the moment felt different now. Not confusion, not fear, just gratitude, deep and steady, for a man who had loved her enough to build an entire fortress of quiet protection around her life, long before she ever understood it was there. "Thank you," she whispered softly, to a man who could no longer hear her, but whose presence she felt everywhere in that house all the same. "For everything you never told me, for everything you built instead of explaining. I understand now. I finally understand." Outside, the desert settled into full darkness, stars beginning to scatter slowly across the enormous Arizona sky, and Emma Walker stood in the doorway of the home her grandfather built, wrapped in the quiet certainty of exactly who she was and exactly where she belonged. She hadn't set out to inherit a legacy. She had simply refused to let one disappear. And in refusing, in standing firm against every threat, every warning, every attempt to erase a lifetime of quiet, selfless protection, Emma Walker hadn't just saved a piece of land, or defeated a dangerous man determined to finish what his father started. She had become, fully and completely, the person her grandfather always believed she could be. Strong enough to stand alone in a room full of strangers, brave enough to hold on to the truth even when the whole town begged her to look away, and loyal enough to spend the rest of her life making sure nobody in Red Valley ever again had to face injustice in silence, the way her grandfather once refused to let a grieving mother face it 30 years before. Sometimes the strongest people are not the loudest. Sometimes courage looks like a young woman standing alone in a room full of strangers, holding on to the only thing that reminds her who she is. And sometimes all it takes is an old jacket, hidden quietly behind a lifetime of work clothes, to bring an entire legend roaring back to life, not as a memory of what once was, but as a promise of everything still yet to come. Family is not always created by blood. Sometimes it is created by loyalty. Sometimes it is created by a promise, kept faithfully across 30 years, and finally passed forward into hands strong enough to carry it.